and welcome Buie. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
You are, you got it.
So Buie is a keyboardist, songwriter, session musician, and producer from Calgary, Alberta, who draws from a multitude of diverse musical interests. He plays a lot of different instruments, and we're so excited to talk to him today so we can learn more about his role in the industry. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Cam, was can you give us a background on yourself? What is it that you do in the music industry, and how did you get started?
Well, I would say the first part of the question, I am more of a player in the musician, like a keyboardist in the music industry. That's kind of like my role in the industry as being a session musician, someone that for hire for a multitude of gigs. And in terms of a background on myself, I originally started playing piano at a really young age because my dad plays piano. He was the first person to kind of teach me stuff, like basics of how to read notes and stuff. But I started taking lessons in second grade. So that was like when I first started to really focus on music. Music was always going to be a hobby for me. It was actually never going to be my career. I was always going to go to school and get like a quote unquote real job and always just do music on the side. But then what happened was in grade 12, I played a piano masterclass, a classical piano masterclass for a professor of piano at the University of Ottawa. And he, after the masterclass was done, said, "So where are you going to go study music?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm not going to go study music. I've already got all my courses picked at the U of A. I'm taking general science." And he was like, "What do you mean you're not going to study music?" And then he convinced me to come, instead of going all the way to Edmonton, he convinced me to go all the way to Ottawa, which was way farther away, because Ottawa had a specific program where you could take science and music kind of joint together. So I started university taking a double major in biochemistry and classical piano performance, which is as brutal as it sounds. I only lasted about 2 years. I did 2 years of that program. And after that, it was like, I couldn't do it anymore. I wasn't making any friends in like either department because all the science kids were like, that's the kid that only takes science half seriously. And all the music kids are like, that's the kid that only is here half the time. So I was never really like in either of them. And also I felt like in my heart, like I had to choose. And I noticed that I just loved all my music classes and I did so well in them. And it was just like, I just dreaded going to all the science classes. So I thought that was a pretty good indicator that I should just switch. And so I switched and did a classical piano degree and went on tour with a band that I used to play in university. We toured the country, wrote songs, sang in it, and then we ran out of money. So I moved back to my hometown of Calgary, Alberta, and it's nice to be here because also in Calgary at that time, the National Music Center had just opened. So there was like a big opportunity for, people to come and, or like musicians, I guess, there's like a lot of opportunity to come home because there was sort of a reason to come home, essentially. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded of an answer.
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
That was great. Music school. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your experience with music school, because I know a lot of musicians, maybe that's not the path that they choose. Maybe they choose to skip that and just be a working musician. But in your experience, do you think it was something that was key to your career, or do you think it's something that was crucial? What was your...
I would say that music school for me was definitely key to where I'd say it's definitely key to where I am now, because it gave me a lot of skills that translate, into like professional skills that I kind of use, on a daily basis. There are a lot of people obviously that don't go to music school. And I think that that's totally a valid way to go as well. It sort of just depends on what kind of musician you want to be sort of in your career. There are a lot of technical skills in terms of communicating with other musicians and writing music and like arranging it and kind of leading a band that I really learned from music school. But at the same time, there's like a cost, and then there's also the cost of like time. Like I delayed, it took me 5 years because I did a double degree. I delayed my kind of entrance into the industry by 5 years, essentially. But for me, I think it was definitely worth it. I always recommend people who are thinking about music as a career to take a music degree, just because it gets you like right in the middle of it. Like you're with all these kids, all these other kids and professors that are, music is their life. And there are a lot of people in my kind of program with me who figured out quick just by going to music school, kind of like what it takes to have a life in music or a career in music. And being especially in a classical program, it was kind of like highly demanding. And so there were a lot of people that really figured out quickly or not if that was what they wanted to do, or if they just wanted to keep music as more of like a side hobby. So.
Let's talk classical music a little bit. One, because I've heard you play and you're incredible, but also
thanks.
a lot of you did an entire performance degree. You are incredible. So a lot of people do start in classical piano a lot. But the kind of dedication it takes to get through all of those grades and then to be able to do an entire post-secondary performance degree is insane. But I noticed in your bio and kind of in everywhere else, you don't even mention classical music as part of the genres of music that you play. So I'm wondering, why did you decide not really to pursue classical music in your like after school profession? Or are you and I just don't know?
It's actually a really like kind of interesting question, because classical music was my first love. That was like the first genre of music that really like drew me in. I was like a total anomaly because I never hated my classical piano lessons growing up. Like I always wanted to go every week and I always practiced. It was the best. I feel like I gravitated away from it because making classical music, specifically a career, is very different than making other genres of music a career. Especially like me as a piano player, it can be easier to make a career out of classical music, but it means a lot of like accompanying violin recitals or accompanying vocal recitals, or like a lot of basically like being an accompanist. And I didn't necessarily want to accompany classical. I didn't necessarily want to accompany, classical music all the time. I wanted to play it and perform it. But I think the biggest deciding factor was the amount of time it takes per piece to perfect it. So a timeline for like a classical performance is like a year in advance. Like you learn all of your stuff like a year in advance. And that's even kind of a tight time schedule pretty much. So I remember my first teacher here in Calgary, I had him for from grade 2 all the way to grade 12. He would plan his concerts about a year and a half in advance. He'd say, I'm picking these pieces because it's going to take me a year and a half to learn them, and then I'll perform them, next year. So sort of it's like the volume of music you have to learn in classical is a huge, impedance or to basically having a successful career. That's why a lot of professional players, they learn, you hear about all these stories about these 14-year-olds that can play all of Chopin's etudes before the time they're 14. And the truth is that you kind of have to have all that music under your belt before you're 14, because by the time you're 25, you've been playing these pieces for 10 years live already. And so I just didn't, I was good, but I wasn't good enough to have a full-on classical career. However, I still practice classical music quite a bit. It's actually the main thing I've been practicing in quarantine here. It's been kind of nice actually, because I don't get any time to practice that stuff when I'm quote unquote busy and working and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, classical music is definitely always a part of me and a part of my heart and the way I like to play. But I like to keep it really as an enjoyment for myself, and also to keep the technical facility. I find that it really helps for other genres as well.
Okay, so not every classical pianist can play other genres outside of classical music. So can you tell us a little bit about when and how you got into playing pop and jazz piano?
For sure. I have always been really interested in all types of music. I was playing in a band in high school, playing in a band in junior high. But I never wanted to be a keyboard player. I was actually so mad at my parents for making me a piano player, because I wanted to be cool. I wanted to play the guitar. I wanted to be standing up, playing an instrument and being able to move, as opposed to sitting down and playing and being stuck in one spot. So I started to try to learn the guitar, and I kind of just I never really got that good. I'm still not that great at it, but it was really just starting to learn and find notes on another instrument that really got me thinking about other genres. And I don't know. I just always I was drawn not just to classical music, but I wanted to play everything. And I kind of had this mentality when I was a kid that if I heard a new type of I heard a new type of music, my brain just went, I have to learn how to play that, because what if somebody asks me to play that one day? Like, it was just this weird tick that I had. So I'd figure out songs on the piano or try to like mimic stuff, because I always, it's going to sound really bad, but I was like, I kind of wanted to be like, I was a quiet kid, but my piano was like the thing I could show off. And I wanted to be able to show off that if anybody asked me to play something, like I could do it. That was kind of like my main thing. So I started to get into it really like in high school. And then I played jazz in the jazz band. I did play, I wrote like some songs and played them for my friends. But it really wasn't until university when I really started to branch out, because I liked classical music, but it's like my brain is so restless that I'm always looking for something else. I'm always looking for like the next thing to learn or the next style to like mimic. And so there was a lot of extracurricular bands to my classical music education in university.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, I've seen you play live, and it's not like you can bring a whole piano on the stage. So can we talk maybe a little bit about, there's pianos and there's keyboards and then there's synthesizers. So maybe for our audience, what is the difference between those two instruments, and how do you use those in a live setting? Maybe you can talk about what your live setup looks like.
For sure. Well, as you can see, I have a wide variety of instruments. The reason that you need so many is because they all do different things. That's what I tell myself anyway, to try to, alleviate some of the stress of having it all. But the main difference is if you have a piano, you have an acoustic piano most of the time. And if you don't have an acoustic piano because you can't carry it around everywhere, you want to get a keyboard. Now, a keyboard at its most basic form basically has samples loaded into it and mimics the sounds of other instruments. Whereas a synthesizer will synthesize the sounds. So I have some synths that you can start basically with the building blocks of sound, the different type of waves, and then you can shape and model these sounds into a new, synthesized sound. So there are a couple different synthesizers. There's synths that are monosynths. They only play one note at a time. And there are polysynths that play chords, multiple notes at one time. So when I'm playing live, I like to have a keyboard that has really good samples of real instruments, so that it sounds kind of like I'm playing a keyboard and I can only lug 20 pounds instead of, half a ton. And then I'll have a synth that strikes a balance between having good lead solo sounds in a monosynth and good accompaniment pad sounds of a polysynth. So I'll usually play my Oberheim, my OB6, and Nord. I'll usually have a double stack two things. Sometimes I'll have three if I'm feeling ambitious. I'll have like my Moog that has all my solo sounds, my Obi that has all of my big pad kind of jump 80s style sounds, and then my keyboard that will play a lot of that will mimic the feel of an acoustic instrument.
I also wanted to ask you a bit about your work now as being a producer. How is your history playing the piano, playing other instruments, knowing a lot about the music theory, the whole music side of it, helped you as a producer?
I think it's helped me quite a bit, because the hardest thing about, or not the hardest thing, the main thing about being a producer is relying on your intuition of taste and what sounds good. So in my classical degree, I spent a lot of time listening to instruments that go well together, instruments that don't go well together, and sort of deciphering the reasons as to why those things why it works that way, essentially. So I feel like, and especially with ear training and, like a lot of the ear tests, playback, recall, identifying chord textures, all that stuff. There was a lot of things in my classical degree that kind of gave me a head start for production. I didn't really get into it seriously until kind of the pandemic started, actually. I had a project I started just for myself on Instagram where I would produce and upload a beat every single day of the month. So I did 30 days in a row. I did a beat, and then I went and said, okay, well, now I'm going to try to like write a quick little song and produce a song for 30 days in a row. So then I did like 30 days of songs. And then now I've been just working on taking those skills and like working on doing like an album of my own songs, which I've always wanted to release my own album, but it's more so just a learning experience of trying to take the process of writing demos all the way to like a mixed product that I can release into the world. So I'm on the newer end of producing, but like I'm working really hard at it and trying my best. I'm doing Kate Stevens' new release and Sid Hall's new release. And so there's some production stuff coming down the road for sure.
Ooh, exciting. That's really exciting. I can't wait to hear what you put out producer wise.
Yeah, it should be coming in the next, like I have about an album that's going to be about 9 songs, and I have 8 of them pretty much ready to go. The 9th one is like been kind of a puzzle, but so it's on the way for sure. It's coming.
Yes, dude, excited. Okay, so you mentioned during lockdown that you've been focusing a little bit on practicing classical piano, which is awesome. What does the rest of your kind of like practice regime look like? Maybe right now and then pre-lockdown when you were a gigging working professional and you could be.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, a lot of people have a really concrete practice routine. I don't find that I have a super concrete practice routine. But I do like to start, like I like to focus on the technical side of things and try to pay as much attention to detail and the touch of the pieces that I'm learning as I can. So I have sort of some quarantine goals. I've been working on 3 Chopin etudes. I've got 2 of them almost down, and the 3rd one is coming along. But when I sit down in the morning or sit down to practice, during the pandemic, I'll start with a piece that's like an etude that's really technically difficult, and I'll really warm my fingers up with that. And then I'll jump into whatever I'm working on. So I find that like, I don't have a lot of specific warm-ups, but I just like to jump in and just get kind of right to the point. But I feel like I have the luxury of practicing now, because before the pandemic, I feel like I didn't really have time to practice like ever. It felt like all of my practicing was kind of like on the stage. So when I was at home, when I was like practicing, it was always just learning tunes or learning, the tunes for the next gig. So I felt like there was enough diversity in what I was learning pre-lockdown that I was always kind of feeling like agile. But for me, the most efficient way to maintain the agility is through classical music. And it's also kind of what I love to practice. So that's sort of, if I don't have a lot of time or if I'm busy, like I have to get something done on, production wise, I'll make sure that I at least play a little bit of some like technically complex etudes or something that I'm learning, just to kind of like feel it through my fingers. And that's my kind of my maintenance every day, essentially.
Okay. And have you taken any kind of lessons post-secondary, like after school?
I have. I had a teacher. Well, after I graduated, I really didn't know essentially what I wanted to, like musically, I felt like kind of lost because I didn't know. I had all this training in classical music, but I didn't have a lot of training in a lot of other genres of music. And I knew that I didn't necessarily want to make classical my career. So I was kind of stuck looking for a teacher. When I moved back to Calgary, I got in touch through some friends with a teacher here. His name's Warren. A lot of like music people know him around town. So I started taking lessons from Warren Rowley, who really showed me and opened my eyes up to a lot of world musics. So like a lot of music from around the world, and not even that, just like how to really play like funk music, how to play Latin music, Brazilian sambas, Cuban huancos, all this like crazy stuff that I hadn't even thought of or conceptualized. He made me learn how to play the congas and the bongos and shakers and like all these other instruments. And I really just like ate it all up. And that's been kind of like, I joke that that was totally like my master's education was taken from him, because it really rounded out my musical skills. And honestly, I don't think I would have tried the production route if I hadn't have taken with him, because he really started getting me thinking about how I can record myself better, how to get better sounds, how to get better tones. And really, I feel like in the back of his mind, he was prepping me for something like a scenario like this, like starting to do more production. So the place that I'm at right now, he's another figure in my life who I owe like a lot to, because he taught me so much about what I didn't know. Sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. And he taught me like so much of what I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to ask, going back a little bit, after you kind of went the classical route, and then how does that apply to being a working musician and working in maybe a band scenario where all of a sudden now you're maybe improvising, writing songs? How do you transfer the classical music to that, or the jazz music to that? Because it's probably not like you're playing etudes on stage so how does that work? It's
a bit of a mental jump, to be honest. I feel like a lot of classical music is taught in a funny and unusual way. Like classical music is the genre where like the written note rules all. It's like the thing that's written on the page, that's like the way you play it, and it's the interpretation of the written note. And the reason classical music relies on that so much is because it's been around for so much longer than recording has. So they didn't have recordings to reference, when these pieces were being made and played. So you really had to get good at interpreting the score. But now, kind of in a post-recording world, especially, for instance, like jazz as an example, the recorded note is like, that's the be-all, the reference, the be-all, end-all. So classical music feels like it's sort of taught in a way that's a little bit archaic now, because it doesn't involve like the recording and the sort of like the reference to the recorded note. So really, I feel that the jump has to come in imagining that a lot of these classical pieces are supposed to be improvisation in real time. So like you have to it's like learning how to see these compositions as improvised sort of performances. And then that way you can transfer a lot of the skills and the technique that you have from classical into, the way you think about improvising, or when you're playing something improvised. Because you have the if you play all these classical pieces, you have the technical facility to play that stuff, but you have to let your inhibitions go and just kind of work up to the point where you can use that technical facility in the moment, and just to make stuff happen in the moment. I don't know if that's totally answers your question. I think I may have gone off on my own little tangent there. But totally. In an improvised band setting, the other thing that classical music did for me that was really good was I took a lot of ensemble classes, so learning how to play classical music with other people. So like piano and violin and piano and voice. And classical music has a very free sense of time, and that really requires a lot of ability to follow other people. So I find that it sounds funny, but you learn how to read other players' body language really well when you're playing classical music, and you can that's how like violinists will always telegraph what they're going to do with the movement of their body. And I kind of got really good at playing with other people, kind of just like reading them on stage. So that was a good skill that I got from classical music, where it's like a lot of other genres, it's the internal pulse. I mean, it's also, reading people in the room as well, but the internal pulse is something you have to add on top of that to, really play well with other musicians in kind of a modern pop setting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure.
Hopefully it does.
And then on top of that, how do you find musicians to collaborate with, especially, I guess, in your role as a keyboardist? What has been your experience, and what has worked the best for you?
My biggest advice for anybody would be to show up. That's like the biggest thing. I mean, right now it's really hard because there's nothing going on, but that was what I did when I first moved back to town. To get into the scene was I treated it like it was a job, where every night I would pick something to go to and just be there and try to like meet people and hang out with people. And then if they are playing, maybe I'll like join in. But really, I feel like being there and being excited to be there is probably the biggest thing that will help you, like, you know, that's like the biggest tool you have. The advice I've been given before is the 3 A's: the availability, the affability, and the ability, within that order. So you have to be available, you have to show up, you have to be affable, you have to get along with people, and then thirdly, the ability will come. Because if you're willing to work and you're willing to show up, then the ability will follow.
Yeah, for sure.
That's good advice. Can you say those 3 A's one more time?
Sorry, now I'm all turned around. You have availability, you have affability, and you have ability, in that order.
Cool. So I love the way that you broke all of that down, and you just gave such great advice. Do you have some specific advice for classical musicians? Like, I know you've kind of like gone around it, but if you were to just kind of give them either musical advice or life advice for people that are just maybe young and like focused on classical music, but, you know, as someone that's in such a broad spectrum of the music industry, genre-wise, what would you say?
Don't feel that you're boxed in because you're playing classical music. There are so many skills that you're learning in class. Like, there are so many skills that you learn through classical music that are immensely applicable to a lot of other genres. And yet it's not taught in that way, or that's not something that comes up often. But if you're focusing on classical music, that training will always help you for, you know, the rest of your musical days. And one of the biggest things that classical gives you is a sense of discipline and how hard you have to work at something in order to get it right. And it's also the perfectionism that comes along with it, because classical music, I can't remember who said it, but there's a famous quote when it's like, forget about perfectionism, leave that to the classical musicians. But it's kind of true, because there's such a focus on having the perfect performance, and that really leads to you to having a lot of discipline when attacking other genres. And I guess that's kind of like, I led into it, but that would be the other thing is, if you're learning, I would definitely advise you to learn other genres, because that also, you know, it goes back and forth. That helps you with your playing your classical and whatnot. But if you're learning a new genre, attack it with the same ferocity that you attack your classical pieces. Don't think that just because it's another genre that there's not as many nuances or like history or things to learn or all that kind of like stories behind the music. It's not just in the one genre that you know. Every genre is an entire world in itself. And classical music really gives you that scope for classical music, but don't forget that that same scope applies to a lot of different other genres as well.
Yeah, for sure. And on that note, is there maybe a piece of advice you would give to your past self? Maybe something you would have done differently or wish you would have known as a young artist just starting out?
It's an interesting question, because it's like, do you mean a young, like what period of my life? Any period?
Yeah, any period. Just a young musician, first maybe getting into the music scene.
It's tough, because it's always a tough question. I hate to get philosophical, but it's always like, if you change anything, would I still be the same person that I am today? But I think that I would probably, I wrestle with this sometimes too, because I would maybe tell myself that I would go back and tell myself that you don't need to do science because you're going to be a musician. But then sometimes I think that I, you know, kind of learned a lot from that experience as well. I would say that maybe I would have taken my own advice that I just gave about giving the seriousness to other genres that I gave to classical music. That's probably what I would tell myself, because I went through a long phase of playing jazz and like being, just because like I had the chops to play, because I had the technical facility that I could just run scales and do whatever, and I was playing jazz. But I wasn't thinking about what I was playing, or I wasn't researching why I was playing those notes, or researching if there was better notes that I could be playing, or thinking about what I was saying with the notes that I was playing, because I hadn't thought that deeply about those genres. So I think that would be the advice, would be just to not kind of brush away genres and think that you can do it just because, because you can kind of like fake it. That's what I would tell myself.
Totally. That's some awesome advice. Thank you so much, Cam, for all of your advice. I think that's going to resonate with a young group of musicians for sure. So thank you for this. Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Yay. Thanks for coming.